I think more brass tacks about it. One of the things that's really helpful is as an Army officer, and in particular an Army aviator, you have to be able to understand the fight through radio calls. Especially when I was a young officer, it was before they had moving map displays and Blue Force trackers. And so when a battle would be going on, you would literally be listening to the radio and looking at your map and making grease marks on that and trying to understand where the friendly forces were, where the enemy forces were, how things were changing. And so the way that it affects my writing is that dialogue is always something that comes easiest to me because I think it harkens back to those days of trying to imagine a fight through listening to radio calls and understanding the intentions behind those calls. And certainly there's more of a military bent to my version of Mitch Rapp than maybe what Vince wrote. And so some of that comes from my own experience. Lots more of it comes from friends.
That's not much of a change for you, right?
My name is Carey. I used to load bombs in the Air Force, and now I'm a writer, a filmmaker, and an entrepreneur. Through using the post 9/11 GI Bill to go to college, working hourly jobs to pay the bills, and freelancing my way into a career, I've studied what it takes to successfully transition from service to civilian, and that study has become a conversation. On this podcast, I speak to other veterans, successful artists, and entrepreneurs about their transition, what they did well, where they failed, what they learned, and most importantly, how they applied their skills.
Episode 109 features Don Bentley, an Army veteran and the author of Capture or Kill, the latest novel in Vince Flynn's series featuring Mitch Rapp.
Welcome. This is Veteran Made.
This episode is brought to you by Go Pills, a nootropic that gives your brain neurotransmitter support both acutely and over time. Those of us that served in the military, regardless of where we served and in what capacity we served, all came into contact with different chemicals, different percussions, and various elements of our environments that have affected our brain's ability to function. Think about your brain's performance and your mental health right now, yes, but think about your future too. We have so much more control over our long-term health than we realize. Visit gopills.com and use code VM15 at checkout for 15% off. That's VM15 for 15% off. Give your brain the neurotransmitter support it needs to perform well right now and over time.
All right. Good morning, Don Bentley. Welcome to Veteran Made.
Thanks for having me, Carey.
Absolutely. Very, very excited. Very excited to chat. For those that don't know who you are, if you could just give us a brief primer on kind of who you are and where and when you served, and then we'll jump into some writing questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the New York Times bestselling author of the Matt Drake series, 4 books there, 4 books in the Tom Clancy, Jack Ryan Jr. series, and now Capture or Kill is my 9th book, but first book in the Mitch Rapp universe. Prior to writing full-time, my wife likes to say that I couldn't figure out what I wanted to be when I grew up, and there's probably some truth to that. I went to The Ohio State University on a Army ROTC scholarship and studied electrical and computer engineering like all good writers do, and then spent 10 years in the Army as an Apache gunship pilot. And I did a tour of duty in Afghanistan from 2005 to 2006 as an air cavalry troop commander. When I got out of the military, I spent some time in the FBI as a special agent and SWAT guy in the Dallas field office, but have spent the majority of my post-military career working for small companies that manufacture technology for the special operations or intelligence communities. So that's me in a nutshell.
I love it. We've got the OSU connection. Obviously, I was just telling you offline, I'm 7 minutes from the Horseshoe right now. I attended myself and actually getting ready to go back for some master's level stuff here in the winter, which I'm excited about. And yeah, it's not often we get to have another Buckeye on the show. So I'm excited about that. And you alluded to studying, in the STEM field and getting into flying and you kind of made the joke of like all good writers do. I'm curious, I want to start with like, where did your journey with writing start? Is it something you did when you were younger? Is it something you picked up in college or in the military?
Yeah, so I think in order to be a good fiction writer, you have to learn how to write. But before that, you have to know how to tell stories or have a desire to tell stories. And so I'm a kid of the 80s, which means I had some magnificent television growing up, stuff like The A-Team and Knight Rider and Blue Thunder and Airwolf. And so I remember even as a kid, writing what you'd call now a fan fiction and trying to figure out a different way for that television show to end. And writing was always my favorite subject in class, sometimes to the detriment of my teachers. I remember having a teacher in elementary school that told me I could not write another G.I. Joe fan fiction thing. Like I had to pick something else this time. And so fast forward to kind of my senior year in high school, I had an amazing teacher for AP English. And at one point she had us write a scene or something like that. And I remember her pulling me aside afterwards and saying, I think you have what it takes. You could actually be a writer. And so I took that advice to heart and went and majored in electrical engineering. And so she actually, her name is Jill Easter. She's long retired now, but she still comes to my book signings when I go back home in Cincinnati, which is pretty amazing. And so I started writing my first book sometime in high school. I had no idea what I was doing and it didn't go far. Tried again in college and still had no idea what I was doing and it didn't go far. And so about 2001, I decided to get serious about writing. And I did two things. The first is I took some classes on Writer's Digest Online that were kind of introductory. Hey, here are the elements of a scene. Here's how you write a short story. Here's how you punctuate dialogue. And so, again, I had that desire to tell stories, but I was missing some of the tools that were required to be able to tell them effectively, especially effectively enough for somebody to pay money for them. And so the second thing I started doing was writing regularly. So I was an Army officer at the time. We would do PT every morning at 6:30. And so I would get up at 4:30 in the morning and work on my book before I went into PT every day. And so I finished my first book right before we went to Afghanistan. It was good enough to get a literary agent, but not good enough to sell. Wrote my second book actually while I was in Afghanistan. Everybody else would come home and play Xbox, and I would drag out my laptop and work on my book. That one got a literary agent too, but didn't sell. And so for my third book, I ended up taking the GI Bill and going back and getting a master's of fine arts in writing popular fiction at this awesome little university called Seton Hill, small Catholic school about an hour east of Pittsburgh. And I'm actually a adjunct instructor there now. And so as I was working on that, your thesis project is a novel. So I wrote my third novel and nobody wanted that one either. And so kind of had a crisis of confidence for a while. I'd written 3 books over 17 years and the world could have cared less. So I was trying to figure out, do I even have what it takes? And a very good friend of mine now, he didn't know me too well then. It's a guy named Nick Petrie who writes the Peter Ash series, fantastic writer. And so we had kind of a heart-to-heart that was supposed to be a 5-minute conversation. And half an hour later, I had my head in his lap and I'm like, I'm never going to be a writer, Nick. And he said, you are me 2 years ago. I wrote 3 books that didn't sell. Go home and write a better book. And so I did. And that one ended up selling.
What kind of mindset were you engaging during that period of time where I mean, you were a writer, right? You're writing, you wrote 3 novels, right? So you are by definition a writer, but you also, as you said, had a crisis of confidence, and that makes sense, right? Like if you're not achieving the goals that you set out to achieve, that's always a bit disheartening. But what kept you coming back, and what did you engage in your mind and in your heart to kind of believe in yourself, that knowing you could push through those perceived failures, at least on the publishing side, and get to where you are?
Yeah, writing's a really strange thing in that it requires both persistence and skill, and you can't do it without either of those. Now, you can argue which of them are more important, but a lot of people don't write regularly, and it is very, very hard to become a successful writer if you don't read a lot and write a lot. So reading a lot means that you need to be an expert in the genre of fiction that you want to write in, because ultimately what you're doing is creating this commercial package for a customer, and you need to understand what those customers expect when they pull your book off the shelf. So one of my really good friends is Brad Taylor. He was a SF officer and was a troop and squadron commander in Delta Force. He writes the best-selling New York Times best-selling Pike Logan series. And Brad and my book should be shelved next to each other because we write in the same genre, but I'm never going to write a better Brad Taylor book than Brad does. And so what I had to do was know my genre well enough to understand what conventions were already out there and write something the same but different. And the only way that you get that knowledge is by reading exhaustively in the genre you're trying to sell into. The second part is writing. And Stephen King, in his book On Writing, famously talks about how writing is more of a blue collar job, and that people discount that you spend a lot of your time just sitting in a chair working. And if you do it day after day after day, you get better at it. And the magic that happens with writing happens because when you write every day or as frequently as you can, the story starts to live in your head. And so then your subconscious gives you little clues while you're, in my case, at the gym doing deadlifts or something. You're like, oh my gosh, that's the problem I've been struggling with. And so that only comes with persistence. Now, the problem is if you switch it from writing to playing golf, you could practice your swing all day, every day. But if you don't have that golf pro there that shows you what you're doing wrong and says, no, your grip is wrong, your stance is wrong, you need to do this, you could practice till you're blue in the face, but you're practicing the wrong things. And so you're not going to get any better as a golfer. And so writing is tricky that way in that it requires both persistence and ideally someone who is farther along the writing path than you are as a critique partner or instructor or something like that to be able to show you how to practice writing better so that you're actually making strides towards becoming commercially viable.
Right. It's all about momentum rather than like motivation, right? Like I think a lot of people have this idea that because it's an art, because it's an art form, therefore it must be like fluffy and spiritual and all this motivation just comes, but you actually create your own momentum rather than rely on motivation. There's that old Pressfield pulled the quote from somebody, right? Who's like, how do you get motivated? It's like, I sit down at the typewriter at 9 a.m. and thankfully motivation shows up every day at 9 a.m., because you're just working, kind of building that momentum. I think that mentorship piece is really interesting. What calculus do you use or did you use, and has it adjusted now moving forward as you've been published as much as you have to find out who those folks are that you rely on in that capacity?
Yeah, Greg Hurwitz is another writer I look up to. He writes the phenomenal Orphan X series, and he is the president of of the International Thriller Writers Association, which puts on a phenomenal conference called Thriller Fest. The first half of Thriller Fest every week when they have it is called Craft Fest, and so you have people like Greg or Tosca Lee or Steve Barry when he was still a member teaching classes on writing. And so it's very unique because these aren't just academic people. They are people who have a proven success in the endeavor you're trying to become successful at, teaching you how to do that. And so that was huge for me from a mentorship. And Greg has this really good reel. If you go to his Facebook page and search for Greg Hurwitz and writing, where he talks about receiving feedback and how to do that as a writer. I learned a tremendous amount when I went back and got my MFA, but I also felt like I lost my mojo a little bit because over that 2.5 or 3 year period, you're receiving feedback constantly. And it's very easy when everybody in the world is telling you what to do with your writing to lose that piece of your writing that is you, that's your voice, that makes you unique. And frankly, many of the folks who are very happy to offer you feedback have not had any more commercial success than you are. And so in some ways it can be kind of like the blind leading the blind. And so in Greg's reel, he talks about that when you solicit feedback, you do it from people who have your best interests at heart and whose feedback hits you in your soul because you say, they're right. I was lazy right there. I didn't do the work that I needed to, or it's kind of the feedback you don't want to hear, but also resonates with you. And that you don't have to, when you receive that feedback, you don't have to execute carte blanche what they told you. you need to answer that feedback in a way that's consistent with your writing, but still takes their feedback into account. And so I was very fortunate. One of my longtime critique partners, I actually met my first day of grad school. He sat down next to me, and he was much further along on the process than I was. His thesis novel actually sold and was turned into a TV show. And so I used him for a long time until I felt like I had my legs under myself and had a good enough sense of my writing to be able to kind of do it on your own. And that never changes, though. A critique partner, once you become commercially successful, your editor becomes your critique partner, because he or she's job is to bring out the very best in your story and to give you that feedback. And so if you, again, it's a very, very hard line to walk, because if you take no feedback, you're never going to get any better. And if you listen to everybody who has an idea, you're going to lose that thing that makes you a unique writer. And so trying to find the balance of those two things is one of the hardest struggles of becoming a commercially viable writer.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's also like, you want to measure, sort of the credentials of the folks that are like, I was surprised when I went to, and my writing background is for the screen, right? For film and now commercials. I was very naive coming out of the military and going to college, both at Ohio State and Full Sail, where I finished. And, I didn't realize that, because you hold adage, right? Like those who can't do, those who can't do teach, right? Well, all my professors at Ohio State and Full Sail were all published writers and authors, or had sold screenplays or even had produced screenplays. So I was learning from people and developing relationships as a military student where I was older, real relationships with people who learned to understand my voice. And so they gave feedback that was both objective in the sense of, formatting, or, flow and knowing what works for the screen, but then also subjective, because they knew me, they knew my voice, they knew how I needed to hear a note. They knew that how I would respond to a note, and were able to kind of work through that. And it became this very integrated relationship, many of which I still have now as I share writing kind of both professionally and some of the things that I do on the side with a couple of them. So it's integrating both of those, that kind of that objective and subjective, through that relationship you build with them. Yeah,
absolutely. And it is, I think that's again why I'll foot stomp kind of Thriller Fest. And there's another great one called Outliers University that Kathy Atram puts together, that has many of those same writers that attend Thriller Fest there. And that if you want to take feedback or notes from people who have actually been successful at this, rather than people who, and there's a time where it doesn't matter who teaches you how to format dialogue, or, what the beats are necessarily in a story. Those kind of things are universal. But when you get into the fact of, is the pacing correct? Does this sell or not? What are the things that are keeping you from being commercially viable? You really want someone who has already been down that path and been successful to give you that feedback, rather than someone who is giving you something they read in a book, because there are just worlds of difference between those two. And I tell people all the time, some of the best learning that happens at a writer's conference happens at the bar afterwards, because you can buy somebody a beer and get a master's class in mistakes they made when they were a debut author, things to ask your publicist about, or your publisher, or, traps you fall into when you're writing a series, or what is it really like writing that second novel, because you have your entire life to write the first one with no deadline. And now all of a sudden you got to turn in a second novel while you're getting feedback for the first, and you have a day job and all of those things. It's very difficult for somebody who hasn't actually experienced that to be able to give you pointers on how to navigate that yourself.
Yeah, I've had I want to go back to something you were talking about, and I think that will kind of segue us into some genre specific questions I have for you. I was in a bit of a writing rut for the last year. So I have a couple of projects that I'm working on, not day job. Luckily for my day job, I get to work in the creative arts, commercial arts, right, which I'm very blessed to do. But that does mean I've had to push my indie stuff, right, kind of to the side and try to develop that on the side, which a lot of writers obviously understand. And those of us that are employed to work this way, this is not me complaining. But I was in a bit of a rut for the last year or so. And I realized it was because my creation to consumption ratio was way over indexed on the consumption side, and I wasn't doing enough on the creation side. And so, as you were mentioning, that being a fan of the genre and consuming as much as you can to understand where your work fits into the marketplace, how do you and how have you over the years understood that ratio for yourself, kind of creation versus consumption, or creation and consumption? Is that something you think about kind of intentionally?
Yeah, but maybe not in the way that you're expressing it. And so what I'll say is that when you're starting out, when somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I want to write thrillers," and I want to write commercial fiction, and I usually say, "Okay, awesome. What genre?" And they say fantasy, and I say, "Okay, tell me the 3 books right now that are bestsellers that your book should be shelved next to." And a lot of times I get a blank stare. And so what that means to me is that you have not done the homework yet required for you to be a successful writer in that genre. Like you have to. So if when my first or second book didn't sell, I was walking through a mall with that same critique partner friend of mine, and it was back when there were still bookstores in the mall. And he said, "Hey, let's go in to this bookstore." And so we walked in, and he said, "Point to me 3 books your book should be shelved next to." And so I did, that were bestsellers. We pulled them off the shelf, and he said, "Let's read the first chapter of each." And we did. And the first chapter of each of those books had either a dead body, a fight scene, or at least a weapon being referenced. And so he looked at me and he said, "Does your book have that?" And it didn't. And so the point being not that there's a rule that you have to follow, but understand that the same reader might buy a book from the romance genre and a book that's an espionage thriller. Same reader can enjoy those, but they're going to have vastly different expectations in those 2 books. And so for my book, they might not have said to me, "Hey, there's no dead body in the first chapter, so I don't really get into this." But they might have said something like, "Man, this book just feels slow to me," or "It didn't really grab my attention." And the reason is because the customers of that genre have been subconsciously primed to expect certain things to happen in a book of that genre. And so you have to instinctively know that as the writer, both so that you decide which of those conventions you're going to adhere to and which that you're going to consciously break to make your book different than, Brad Taylor's book. And so I read, and you should be able to discuss at length the history of your genre, who the greats are, how it's changed over time. Like you have to be a student of that genre and of the people who write in it. And because it's the same thing if we were selling soap instead of books, you as the person in charge of creating the soap that's going to be sold has to know what kind of soap are people using right now? What are the different scents for it? Who is buying it? Why? What are the competitors for it? And we try to separate the commercial aspects of commercial fiction from the fiction. And to be successful, you really can't do that. Now, I still read very, very heavily in the genre. Mine's changed a little bit in that right now I'm working on my second Mitch Rapp book. And so when I'm doing that, I read a lot of Mitch Rapp books because I want to make sure that I am writing in the same way, not in the same style, but in the same universe that Vince created, and I'm being true to his characters. I think when you're published and when you're working on something, sometimes you have to narrow that window some. For instance, there was a couple years ago where Brad Taylor came out with a book that had to do with China, as I was writing a Tom Clancy book that had to do with China. And I love Brad Taylor, but I knew I didn't want to read that book because even subconsciously, I didn't want to be derivative of it, or I didn't want it to get in the way of my creative process. Because I think too often, going back to the how to accept notes or feedback. When you are writing that first draft, it's kind of, I love watching those survival shows or the reels about people building fires and shelters and stuff. And that first draft is very much this little fire that you're kindling. You have tinder and you're nursing it into existence, and one stiff breeze can blow those embers out and you lose that fire. And so when you're writing that first draft, I'm very, very protective about what I read, because I don't want, number one, anything to influence me, and then number two, to think, man, this really sucks and he or she's really good, and it blows that fire out. Now, there are other genres that I read more frequently. I'm also a big fantasy fan. Like, I love Jim Butcher. I love urban fantasy. Side note, I think Jim Butcher does suspense better than most thriller writers do. And you as an author have to be able to look at what another writer's doing and do close reading and be able to break down, how are they doing this? When my second book didn't sell, I took my favorite Vince Flynn book, which was Protect and Defend, and I note carded out the whole book. I used a separate note card color for every character. I would put little stars on it when it was a fight scene. And I broke it into the 3-act structure, and I taped it to my bedroom wall because we didn't have an office at the time. And so it's, doing that is kind of the difference between looking at a building and looking at the blueprints of the building. And if you want to write commercial fiction, you have to read a book first as a reader and then go back and read it as a writer and say, how is the writer, how are they maintaining tension? How are they raising stakes? Where's the reversal? How did they set up the reversal? And Jim Butcher is phenomenal at that. There have been many in my writing classes. I recommend him quite a bit. And so I think that's another thing that you have to figure out as a writer. But I think I don't have a consumption to production ratio, kind of like what you're talking about. But I think you reading is what feeds the creative machine. And sometimes you have to be a little more selective about what you read depending on what you're working on.
That's like pagecraft, right? It's like, where am I going to get cross-functional, whether you're reading, Butcher or Taylor, and then where are you going to avoid, right? Like you're describing with Taylor, where you want to make sure that, like, hey, he's writing that, I'm writing this. I both want us to be successful. So, kind of want to, there's some wisdom and discernment there, rather than just like you don't want to overthink it, but you also don't want to underthink it either. Just like take that path and move forward. So I was telling you offline, this is fun. This is the first Mitch Rapp book I've read in probably like 15, like maybe 20 years. My grandma and I used to share books like this back and forth, and other books. We were very close when I was growing up, and she was a big reader, and that's part of where I got it. And she loved this genre, and we don't really have connections to the military family. I military in our family. She just kind of like enjoyed that. So it was really fun for me to read this, because I haven't read this character in so many years, and it brought back so many fun memories of her, but then also kind of my entrance into reading commercial fiction like this as a kid, as a high schooler, and which was just an awesome experience. What was it like for you to jump into a world that had been, I know you've done it, you had done it before, excuse me.
Yeah.
What was it like to jump into Vince's universe? And question one. And then question two is, you have obviously tactical experience, you have aviation experience, you have these experiences that Vince and Kyle Mills didn't have. So that I think probably affected the way you wrote in certain ways. But what was it like to jump in? And then what was it like to bring your experiences to bear into that world?
Yeah, so taking over for Vince was pretty heavy for a couple of reasons. And so first off, he is my favorite living author. I think maybe Daniel Silva. He's such a smooth writer, and he manages to have incredibly beautiful prose, but still write kind of in the thriller adjacent world. And so as a fan, like, I loved Vince, and like I told you before, I went back to his writing when I was trying to figure out how to be a better writer myself. He's the guy I wanted to be someday. And so, to get to write in his universe is surreal, but it's also kind of heavy as a fan, because you don't want to do something that would take anything away from the other fans continuing to enjoy that. I think too, when they announced that I was taking over for Kyle, and a little shout out to Kyle, when Vince passed away, nobody knew whether the series was even going to continue. And so Kyle agreed to do that, and took a little bit to release his first book that was called The Survivor, because he went back and reread all of Vince's books again to make sure he wanted to, again, kind of the same thing I said, make sure he could capture what Vince did in his own way. And so Kyle could have just done the next adventures of Mitch Rapp and given just kind of a yearly thing, but he was not content to tread water. And in fact, he expanded the Mitch Rapp universe in ways that I don't think anybody could have imagined. And so when they announced that I was taking over for Kyle, I got a text from David Brown, who is both of our publicists, and he said, it's trending on Twitter right now. And the reason why it was trending on Twitter was that folks were saying, I love this series. It's my favorite in the new world, or in the whole world. I don't know who this writer is, and I hope he doesn't screw this up. And so as a fan, like, I totally get that. And I didn't experience as much of that with Clancy, because Clancy is almost a corporation. Like, there are Clancy movies, Clancy video games, Clancy books that are published by other publishers, Clancy books that were published by my publisher, but there had been half a dozen writers already who wrote them. And so I think the fan base was much more accepting of the fact that writers could move in and out of the Clancy universe, but the editor, Tom Colgan, chose those writers very well and maintained the guardrails on the series. Kind of like maybe Star Wars now is a bad example because they're on rough times, but used to be Star Wars that when you got stories that were canon in that universe, maybe you knew the writer and maybe you didn't, but you knew they weren't going to upset the apple cart and tick you off as a fan. And so when I came into taking over for Kyle, it much more felt like I was being invited into the family business. You know, the Vince's legacy is still guarded by Emily Bessler, who was his editor and was Kyle's editor. She's also Brad Thor and Jack Carr's editor. She's an incredible editor. And then Sloan Harris, who was Vince's literary agent and who still represents the estate. And so they were very, very welcoming, but also very, very protective, and rightfully so, over what they had built. And so there was certainly a feeling of not heaviness on my part, but very much of, like I said, imagine you're being invited in as a partner to this family business that still has the original members there, and that somebody has spent their entire life building, and now they're entrusting to you. It's a pretty weighty feeling.
How did you deal with that feeling? What did you do to manage that feeling and the associated feelings that I'm sure are downstream of it, especially as you started to work? What techniques did you employ?
Yeah, and so part of the reason why Capture or Kill is what it is came from my response to those feelings. And so Capture or Kill answers the question that Vince Flynn fans have been asking for the last 13 years, which is, what role did Mitch Rapp play in the operation to capture or kill Osama bin Laden? And so the book is actually set back in 2011, back in the era when Vince wrote the books. And so Vince did something very interesting in that he aged Mitch Rapp in real time. And so every time a book came out, you know, if his book came out in 2007, Mitch Rapp was 2007 years old. And whatever events happened in the real world, you know, Vince might draw upon for that book. And so he did that until Pursuit of Honor. And after Pursuit of Honor, he went back in time to tell Mitch's origin story. And he did that through two books, American Assassin and Kill Shot. And then Vince jumped forward in time and picked the series up with what was tragically his final book before he passed away from cancer, and that was The Last Man. And so in between Pursuit of Honor and The Last Man was this gap of time that was kind of a black hole. Nobody knew what Mitch Rapp had done in those 3 or so years. And so originally I was reading all of Vince's books over again because, again, I didn't want to start my first book kind of being a derivative of a derivative. I wanted to go back to the source material and immerse myself in how Vince thought about things. And so when I discovered that gap, I'm like, that's kind of interesting. I'm sure Mitch Rapp wasn't sitting home watching TV during those 3 years. I wonder what he was doing. And so I looked at it, and one of those years happened to be 2011, which was when Osama bin Laden went to meet his maker, thanks to SEAL Team 6. And so as I was looking at that, I thought, that's a pretty big world event. I wonder if Vince ever addressed that. And so on his website, there's a section where fans used to write in and ask him questions, and he would answer them and post the question and answers on there. So I did a bunch of digging around, and I found a question from a fan that asked him that and said, hey, what was Mitch Rapp doing when the bin Laden raid went down? And so Vince kind of answered it a little bit generically and said, hey, the SEALs, and rightfully so, kind of get all the attention for, shooting him in the face. But in order to set the conditions for that raid, there was a tremendous amount of intelligence work that went on, and I'm sure Mitch Rapp would have had something to do with that. And so I kind of took that and ran with it, and that's where Capture or Kill came from. But really, part of my reason for writing that book is I felt like, number one, I had to earn credibility with the Vince Flynn fans to be able to say, okay, this guy gets it. Like, he is a fan. His writing stays true to Vince's original intent. And what better way to do that than to go back and have Vince Flynn be my training wheels, right? And so by inserting Capture or Kill between Pursuit of Honor and The Last Man, I've got Vince on either side of me. And so that was it was good way to help deal with that feeling on one hand. It was also challenging on the other side because I'm using a real world event as kind of the heartbeat for this book, and I wanted to stay as true to that as possible. And then secondly, from a fiction perspective, I had to be very careful that anything that I did in this book was new and different and worthy of people picking up the book and reading it, but also didn't inadvertently cause ripples in the Vince Flynn universe that would have had an effect on all the books that came after mine. And so it was a little bit of a juggling act, but I think hopefully the fans think it turned out all right.
It sounds like for you, like I love all of that. And obviously it came from the answer to kind of the emotional question, right? The question about like how you were feeling and how you dealt with it. You just went super deep, and you just went as deep as you could into the world and just enveloped yourself in the world, and then just got to work on it, which I think is great. You didn't overthink it. You just went in there and started working out from there. Which is I think a great way to do it. And having just read the book, I think you managed it very successfully.
Thank you.
So a couple things with weaving kind of fictional and historical there. Obviously, it's a precedent that had been set in the series. You chose a very specific one, which I think is a really cool entrance into it for you. What was that decision-making process like for the other stakeholders? Did you have to pitch that? Did you have to pitch it hard? Or did everybody say, oh, that's a great idea, run with it?
Yeah, so writers tend to fall into one or two camps, and they're either plotters, which means they understand the story before they start writing. And so usually that means they write a synopsis or an outline before they put pen to paper on the book. And so Kyle Mills is famous for talking about his 42 or 52,000 word outlines that he will do before he writes a book. And so he understands the story pretty in depth before he starts writing. I fall into that second camp, which is you can be charitably termed. Stephen James calls it writing organically. The less charitable term is writing by the seat of your pants, or being a pantser. And so what that means is you don't know the story until you write the first draft. So you're telling it to yourself. And Lee Child and Stephen King are both famous for, I think Lee Child, in his typical manner, somebody asked him if he outlined, and he said, why in the hell would I want to do that? I'd already know the ending of the story before I wrote it. And so when you write that way, what that means is that your subsequent drafts, you have to do the work at one point and the other. You either do it before, if you're a plotter, or you do it after, if you're a pantser, in subsequent revisions. Because for me, a lot of times I will, be 5 chapters in and realize this entire plot line shouldn't be there. Or this character is really something else. And I'll literally just add a note to myself at the beginning of the chapter and list bullet points of things that have now changed in this new chapter. And you have to clean that up on the next draft. And so, as you can imagine, that makes pitching the story a little bit more difficult. And so, when I was writing the Clancy books, the very first Clancy I wrote was called Target Acquired. And my editor said, hey, you have to write a synopsis before you start on this book so the estate can approve it. And I was like, Tom, you know I don't work that way. And he said, I know. Just write the synopsis, a couple pages. We'll turn it into them, and then we'll just update them once you finish the book. And I said, okay, fine. And so fast forward a year and a half later, the book's done. It's about to come out. And Tom calls me back up and he said, hey, the UK is doing their own version of the cover for this book. And so they want a synopsis to be able to read. He's like, I've got your 3-page synopsis here. I know it's not completely tracking the book that you wrote, but can you just review it and tell me what the cutoff is? Do I send up 2 pages, 2.5 pages? And so I read it, and then I came back and I said, about the first 3 sentences are good. The rest of it has nothing to do with the book I wrote. And so for fast forward that to Capture or Kill, I knew, number one, in Emily and Sloan were both incredibly supportive of me, but I felt I still had something to prove to them because they're taking a risk on me. And so I wanted to pitch the idea for the story to both of them. And so the first one I did was to Emily, and I was pretty intimidated to talk to her. She is a phenomenal editor to work with, but she's also one of the giants in the industry. And so we had maybe met once, but we really didn't know each other. And so we were doing it via a Zoom call, and Emily was working from home that day. And I think she had her laptop set up on her kitchen counter. And so I'm watching her walk around her kitchen counter. And as I'm pitching it, I can tell she's listening, but she's not looking at me at all. She's kind of doing stuff over here, and she walks over here and doing stuff. And in my head, all I could think is like, she absolutely hates this, and I'm about to get fired. And so I kind of, just wound up and said, in the end, that's it. And so she stopped what she was doing, looked at me in the camera, and she's like, I love it. Write that story. And I'm like, oh my gosh. All right. Everything's fine. And so then the next person I had to pitch, Vince's agent, he was, I couldn't see his reaction because it was via the phone, and he was completely quiet through the whole thing. And I got done and he said, so let me get this straight. You're going to put Mitch Rapp as number 2 in the stack behind Rob O'Neill. Is that what you're telling me? And I'm like, of course, that's not what I'm telling you. The story's not going to be anything like that. And I had no idea what the story was going to be like, other than it was going to involve the Bin Laden raid. And so that's kind of how it worked for me, but it's very different for each editor and each writer. Some of especially if you're doing legacy work, sometimes they're much more stringent on approval authority. Sometimes they want pages that are work in progress. And that all depends on you as the writer, your editor, and the relationship you have together.
Yeah, I love it. I don't want to spoil anything for anybody, but it is great how it all comes together, and it's fun because you utilize your experience as an Army aviator throughout the book, and then pretty specifically in that climax there, which I think was a ton of fun to read. On that note, what did your military experience bring to kind of sentence level writing here, story level writing, like kind of coming into the series as somebody with experience in this world where the other 2 guys didn't? Not obviously to denigrate them, but just there is a difference between what you're able to bring and what they're able to bring.
Yeah, there is a difference, but I will, like I said, caveat that by saying, Tom Clancy was an insurance salesman with a library card. He never had any service. Vince Flynn was a bartender. Brad Thor was a travel writer. And so there are many folks, Mark Graney never had any military experience. There are many folks in this genre who are superb writers who are just curious and did research and have friends and stuff and are still able to write incredible books. Even me, my first book, Without Sanction, that had my protagonist, Matt Drake. He's a former Army Ranger and a current intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency. I was doing a radio interview, and the interviewer said, "Are you Matt Drake? Are you your protagonist?" And I said, "I am absolutely not my protagonist, but I've stood in the same room with men who could be. And that is absolutely true. I think more than my military experience, what has helped me is having relationships with men, and in some cases women, who could be Jack Ryan or Mitch Rapp or Matt Drake, and being able to see how they think, how they approach the world, how they talk to each other has been invaluable, and is really what I think very few folks are fortunate enough to have friends in the special operations community, coworkers, customers. And so part of what I do when I write is to try and show that community from the vantage point that I've been blessed enough to have as a friend, as a coworker, things like that. I think more brass tacks about it. One of the things that's really helpful is, as an Army officer, and in particular an Army aviator, you have to be able to understand the fight through radio calls, especially when I was a young officer. It was before they had moving map displays and Blue Force trackers. And so when a battle would be going on, you would literally be listening to the radio and looking at your map and making grease marks on that and trying to understand where the friendly forces were, where the enemy forces were, how things were changing. And so the way that it affects my writing is that dialogue is always something that comes easiest to me, because I think it harkens back to those days of trying to imagine a fight through listening to radio calls and understanding the intentions behind those calls. Certainly there's more of a military bent to my version of Mitch Rapp than maybe what Vince wrote. He does have some books that have, and the name of it, which one? It might be Protect and Defend even. There's an awesome scene where they do this cross border raid into Pakistan, and you can tell Vince was just having a blast writing it, because he brings in the Navy SEALs who go take out a whole bunch of terrorists as they're snatching this guy. And it's a really well done segment or sequence that's kind of military thriller-esque. But in Capture or Kill, so I was an air cavalry officer. One of the things you did as a cavalry officer was area reconnaissance, and I wanted to show what one of those looked like in Afghanistan. And so there's a character in my book, Kelsey Smith, who is an Army aviator, who is a real Army aviator. He and I were troop commanders together in Afghanistan. He stayed out and retired as a colonel after I left the Army. And so I ended up calling him up for this and say, hey man, this is what I'm trying to do in Afghanistan, and walk me through again how we did a zone reconnaissance or an area reconnaissance. And so he's an actual character. There's another pilot in there, Darren Swan, that's mentioned in the book, that was a friend of mine. We flew together in Afghanistan. He was actually Kelsey's safety officer. And so that's kind of the fun stuff. And I try to put as much of that in there as possible, where here's kind of the insider fun things to put you in the front seat of an Apache, or put you as number one in a tactical stack entering a building. And so some of that comes from my own experience. Lots more of it comes from friends. And another example of that, there's a character in this book called Jason Beefley, who in this book is a CIA paramilitary officer. Jason in real life is one of my closest friends, and he spent some time in the Ranger Regiment, but spent the majority of his career in an Army Special Mission Unit. And he is my go-to guy when it comes to tactics or weapons, or especially at the small unit level. He has, before in my book, Hostile Intent, I wanted to do a classic ambush, and Jason actually, we traded maps back and forth where he drew it on there and told me where to emplace different elements of the team and how it would work. And so that's one of the fun things about writing in this genre, for sure.
Yeah, I love it. I laughed out loud at obviously I didn't fly. I was a maintainer. But I did spend a lot of time on those bases like that in Afghanistan. I laughed at the steak scene. I'll just leave it at that for folks that are going to listen.
It was real. It's a real thing.
Oh yeah, I know. Which is cool. And kind of back to the intelligence thing that you were talking about before then, I think what's, like you were saying, for those of us that have been in these rooms and know folks like this, they're never going to write these stories themselves. They're never going to portray themselves this way. They're never going to do that. So you and others are bringing a perspective that they wouldn't share. And so it actually brings a a kind of a realism to it in a way
Yeah.
that makes it fun and accessible for an audience that otherwise would just never get to understand, at least at a basic level, how things like this may or may not go down. Right.
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to wrap things up here. One question about Afghanistan: you wrote this after the drawdown, tragic situation, and you're also kind of looking back on the war as a whole, right in the middle of it. What was that like for you? Did you bring any? What kind of thoughts and feelings did you have as you were writing? What kind did you bring? I noticed some specific sentence level things in there that I thought were poignant and interesting critiques. What also respecting those of us that were there doing what we were doing. What was that like for you?
Yeah, so the really amazing thing about the War on Terror and Operation Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom is over a 20-year period of time, less than 1/4% of the American population willingly bore their nation's combat requirements, right? For 20 years, 1/4%. And most of that 1/4% served multiple tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, perhaps both, or at least. So again, going back to Kelsey, I served one year tour in Afghanistan. I think he served a combined 5 years of his life away from his wife and his kids in either Iraq or Afghanistan. And so the fourth book in my Matt Drake series is called Forgotten War. And our with tragic withdrawal from Afghanistan and subsequent collapse happened right before I was writing that book. And it just wrecked me. Like, I couldn't work for 2 weeks. I was getting text messages and emails and calls from veteran friends saying, all basically asking a variation of this question: was it worth it? Was the 20 years of blood and treasure and friends lost and time away from families, was any of that worth it? And I didn't know how to answer that question. And so when I wrote Forgotten War, I really wanted to just give the vantage point of a veteran and the veterans that I'm close with on what their thoughts were about that withdrawal and their service, without trying to be political about it. Just to say, since only 1/4% of the U.S. population bore that burden, the majority of Americans have no idea what it was like to serve there. And many of them don't even know anybody who did on a personal basis. And so that book was really hard to write. And certainly some of that came out in Capture or Kill, because I remember I was there in 2005, 2006. And so even then, it was only 4 years after that. But we could see that we were starting to hit a point where it felt like we were treading water, and like, what is the end state here? What exactly are we trying to do? And I think it is a tragedy that was allowed to continue for 20 years. And certainly the people like Mitch Rapp in real life, who went back there 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 times, they knew at some point that there did not seem to be an endpoint for that mission. There did not seem to be a path or a strategic plan towards victory. And I thought that, again, one of the worst mistakes you can make as a writer, especially a fiction writer, is to get up in your pulpit and hit readers over their head with something. But I think I would have also been remiss not to share some of the frustrations that I certainly had, and other veterans who did far more than I did expressed. And so you see some of that in Capture or Kill.
Yeah, well said, and well done with the story. Where can folks find you on social, online? Where can they find your work? Where do you want to drive traffic?
Yeah, sure. So my website is donbentley.books.com. It's Bentley. You can go there and buy all the books I've written or get information on it, and you can sign up for my newsletter. Everything that I'm working on, you can find there. If you're a social media person, I'm on X, Instagram, and Facebook, and my handle for all three is the same. It's at Bentley Don B. So just BentleyDonB. I love interacting with readers. I'm going to get to go on tour here starting next Monday, September 7th, and I'm be in a crazy number of cities. You can go to my website for information on the tour, how to get signed copies, of capture or kill, all of that stuff. But please come out and see me if you're in one of those cities. I'd love that.
I'm bummed you're coming to Mason on that tour.
Yeah.
I'm in Columbus. I'm going to be out of town for work that entire week. I'm going to be up in Toronto. Super bummed wasn't able to make it down for that. But yes, this episode is going live as we're recording next week when the book is launched. The book is available. We'll link that out in the show notes. And we'll tweet out content. We'll put out IG posts and collaborate, all that good stuff, and share it far and wide. Don, to end each episode of the podcast, I ask an open-ended question. What's on your heart and your mind for our community? Could be a piece of advice, something you want to get off your chest, or something you want to reiterate that we've already talked about today. But Don, what's on your heart? What's on your mind?
Yeah, I think, and I'll try and say this quickly because it's a much longer conversation, but I think when veterans separate from service, especially veterans who have gone into harm's way, you do not realize what a big transition that is going to be. And oftentimes, especially if you're serving in active duty, when you make that transition, you unintentionally cut yourself off from the only group of people who actually understand what that transition is like. And so what I would say to you as a veteran, the thing that will help you the most is maintaining a community of fellow veterans. And so whatever that looks like for you, whether it's reaching out to people you served with before or making friends with folks who have served that are closer in your community, you need to do that and not isolate yourself from people who understand you.
Well said. Couldn't agree more. Very important. Don Bentley, appreciate your time, appreciate your words, appreciate your work. I'm looking forward to going back and reading some of the old Mitch Rapp novels now, especially now that we've talked about this and getting some of the kind of inside info about how you and Kyle and others have done it. And very excited to see what's next with Mitch Rapp for you with the next novel. And we'll have you back and chat then.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for having me, Carey.
Thanks, Don. We'll see you.
All right.